establishing central control and preparing to develop pieces outward. This opening thrust immediately influences the board's geometry. Developing a knight to the central light squares immediately stakes a claim and prepares for flexible pawn structures. Asserting central control, white immediately contests the d-pawn and opens lines for queen and bishop development. A solid foundation for development, preparing to challenge the center and unlock the bishop's diagonal. Developing the knight to a central square immediately reinforces white's control of key central squares and prepares for further pawn advances. Pinning the knight immediately creates tactical pressure, potentially disrupting white's pawn structure if not addressed carefully. Reinforcing the center now frees the bishop, preparing a more solid pawn structure against black's active piece. Securing the monarch's safety is paramount, a wise preemptive measure before deeper strategic engagements unfold. Developing the bishop towards the kingside opens up lines and prepares for potential kingside expansion or pressure. Opening the queenside diagonals for the bishops and pressuring white's center simultaneously. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside development, this move creates a balanced position where white aims to build pressure slowly. Unleashing the central pawns now seeks to immediately challenge white's space and opening up critical diagonals for black's pieces, potentially disrupting white's harmonious development and forcing difficult decisions regarding pawn structure and piece placement. Castling now shores up the king and prepares the queen's rook for future action, a sensible consolidation after black's central pawn thrust. Black opens up the d-file, inviting a structural decision. This exchange gambits a pawn for tempo, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially create an outpost for the knight on c5 or e5. The ensuing tension will test white's ability to defend the queenside while developing their pieces harmoniously. Opening up the e-file now creates immediate dynamism, potentially targeting black's underdeveloped queenside and initiating a fight for central control that was momentarily softened by the pawn exchange. Releasing the central tension with the pawn capture opens up the d-file, potentially for your rook, and invites piece play as the queenside develops. Be mindful of white's bishop pair and the open diagonals it creates. Opening up the diagonal for the bishop, white aims to exploit the slightly exposed black king, while also preparing to contest the d4 square with active piece play and potentially a future e4 pawn push to seize more central territory and space. Developing the queen's bishop to b7 prepares to challenge the white pawn on c4 and potentially exploit the newly opened diagonal towards white's castled king. Placing the bishop on g5 creates immediate pressure on black's knight, potentially forcing a recapture that loosens black's queenside pawn structure, a small positional concession black would prefer to avoid. Developing the bishop to b7 clears the c8 square for the queen and prepares to contest the long diagonal, a crucial strategic decision aiming to alleviate kingside pressure and establish a more balanced pawn structure. Restoring piece activity is paramount, and the rook's redeployment to the central file aims to directly challenge black's pawn structure and pressure the c-file, potentially preparing for future advances or piece sacrifices in that sector. A timely knight repositioning that simultaneously challenges white's central pawn structure and prepares to contest the semi-open c-file, demonstrating good coordination with the queen's bishop. Securing the open file before black can establish counterplay on it is a shrewd positional decision, channeling white's forces towards a more active role in the center and queenside. Challenging the bishop's placement directly addresses the pressure on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated attack and gain some breathing room for black's pieces. Unpinning the knight allows white to eye the king's flank, potentially preparing to target f7 or reroute the bishop to a more aggressive diagonal, while also liberating the queen to join the central skirmish and apply pressure to black's queenside pawn structure. Bringing the rook to the open c-file is a decisive step, challenging white's control and preparing for potential future skirmishes along this crucial corridor. This redeployment not only bolsters black's queenside presence, but also hints at a more aggressive posture, perhaps aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure or to exert pressure on the c-file itself. It's a move that signifies a clear intention to compete for active piece play and to seize the initiative on this critical open line. Relocating the bishop to d3 seeks to improve its diagonal scope, potentially eyeing the kingside if the pawn structure shifts, while also preparing to contest the c-file should the opportunity arise. A logical retreat, repositioning the bishop from the vulnerable long diagonal to a more secure square, a sensible decision given the open lines and potential threats developing around the queenside. The bishop retreats to b1, a seemingly passive repositioning that nevertheless subtly aims to reinforce the kingside and prepare for potential central pawn breaks, while also offering a safe square should the queenside become congested. The knight's ambitious leap to the edge of the board isn't a typical defensive maneuver, but rather a bold attempt to disrupt white's well-established central pawn structure and potentially attack the kingside indirectly. By occupying the h5 square, black aims to provoke a reaction from white, perhaps forcing the bishop back to a less active square or even creating an opportunity for a pawn lever on the kingside. It also cleverly eyes the f4 square, suggesting a future kingside pawn push or a knight redistribution. This is a position where controlling key squares and anticipating the opponent's creative ideas are paramount. Unleashing the queen to pressure the knight and prepare for a central advance, white seeks to exploit black's slightly passive piece placement and potential weaknesses around the d5 square. Fortifying the kingside becomes paramount as the knight retreats to its starting rank, subtly preparing for a potential pawn storm or repositioning to a more active square, while the bishop on b7 now has a clearer diagonal to survey. Re-establishing the bishop's presence on the g3 diagonal aims to put pressure on black's kingside structure and potentially create tactical opportunities, while also freeing up the e3 pawn from direct bishop defense. Sacrificing a knight for a pawn might seem dubious, but it opens up the g-file and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure. This bold exchange forces a reassessment of the kingside, potentially exposing the white monarch if the follow-up play is precise. The knight's departure leaves a slight weakness on the f5 square, which white will surely eye for their pieces. It's a tactical gamble that could lead to either a sharp advantage for black or a quick positional disadvantage if white can consolidate effectively. Consider the subsequent pawn pushes and piece repositioning that this action necessitates. Opening the h-file with this pawn capture creates a permanent weakness on g3, potentially inviting future attacks on your monarch, while simultaneously granting black's knight a promising outpost on f4 if it can reposition there. Black finally decides to activate the bishop that has been passively observing the queenside, aiming to improve its scope along the long diagonal and potentially prepare for a queenside pawn advance later on, while simultaneously offering a retreat for the knight on f6 should it be pressured by the e-pawn. A significant strategic adjustment, this rook's relocation to the c-file aims to contest black's asserted influence, preparing for a potential push of the d-pawn while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn structure and creating a dual threat along the open file. Preparing to contest the central files and fortify the kingside, the bishop retreats to a more resilient diagonal. Preparing to seize the crucial e-file, white repositions the queen for an aggressive advance, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king and potentially create threats along the open file. A subtle repositioning, this knight retreats from immediate contact, eyeing a potential re-entry onto the kingside via f5 or even g6 if the situation allows. It signifies a temporary concession of central space, but strategically prepares for a more active role once the defensive structure solidifies and potential attacking avenues open. The king's safety remains paramount, and this maneuver helps avoid immediate tactical skirmishes while maintaining defensive flexibility. Unleashing a knight towards the black king's dominion, this maneuver aims to exploit the potentially weakened kingside after the exchange of pawns and the subsequent pawn push. It's a bold assertion of centralized power, seeking to disrupt black's nascent coordination and potentially target the lightly defended squares around the king. The rook tucks away, establishing a defensive posture along the c-file, a prudent step given white's central piece activity and the potential for future pressure. This maneuver aims to bolster the pawn structure's integrity, particularly the c7 square, and prepare for a possible defensive retreat if the central tension escalates unfavorably. It's a move that prioritizes solidifying the position, understanding that sometimes the most effective development involves waiting and reacting rather than initiating immediate complications. A bold advance to seize the central dark squares, aiming to disrupt Black's well-established piece coordination and potentially exploit the weakened king's defense should the pawn structure ever fracture. This maneuver skillfully redirects pressure towards the queen side, activating the knight to a more menacing square and challenging White's central pawn structure. Shifting the queen to f4 immediately targets the weak f7 square, leveraging the pinned knight on e5 and creating immediate pressure on Black's kingside, potentially disrupting their defensive structure. Unlocking that h-file will be a significant battleground, potentially leading to a crucial pawn storm or a desperate defense of your king. Unleashing a pawn storm to disrupt Black's kingside is a bold gambit, aiming to pry open lines for White's pieces while simultaneously creating attacking chances. Exploiting the open file, Black bravely plunges into a pawn sacrifice, aiming to disrupt White's central coordination and expose the enemy king's safety. This bold pawn grab initiates a cascade of tactical possibilities, forcing White to react decisively or risk falling into a dangerous counterattack where the knight on e5 becomes a prime target. The knight's bold thrust into g4, a calculated gamble, shatters Black's nascent pawn shield and opens a crucial diagonal for White's queen. This aggressive repositioning not only aims to disrupt Black's defensive setup, but also creates immediate threats against the enemy king, forcing a reassessment of Black's defensive strategy. White is actively seeking to exploit the compromised pawn structure on the kingside. The rook's relocation to d7 ignites a subtle but potent strategic pivot, aiming to bolster the g6 pawn and, more importantly, prepare for potential maneuvers along the now open d-file, creating a flexible platform for further action and subtly challenging White's centralized queen. Unleashing a knight towards the kingside, this maneuver aims to exploit the newly opened g-file and create attacking possibilities against Black's castled position. Recapturing with the knight opens a diagonal for the Black queen and initiates a fascinating dance of pieces around White's awkwardly placed king. Suddenly, the rooks find themselves on the same open file, a dynamic shift creating pressure on the queenside and opening avenues for potential breakthroughs, as White reasserts central control through this timely repositioning. The knight's retreat to e7 relinquishes the central outpost it just fought for, potentially signaling a shift towards defensive consolidation rather than immediate counterplay. Shifting the rook to this adjacent file initiates a subtle repositioning, aiming to reinforce the queenside pressure while preparing to potentially double rooks later, thereby increasing control over open and semi-open files that could become crucial in the ensuing middle game struggle. Black reestablishes a presence on the open d-file, a crucial artery for piece activity and potential future breakthroughs, effectively challenging White's central control and preparing to contest the initiative. Reinforcing the e-file presence aims to build pressure on Black's weakened kingside pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the enemy king, although White must be wary of Black's active pieces and potential counterplay along the central files. Reclaiming the initiative on the crucial d-file by forcing White's rook to choose between defending the piece or maintaining its pressure is a bold maneuver, aiming to disrupt White's established central control and potentially open lines for counterplay. Unlocking the file for potential infiltration, White bravely sacrifices central pawn structure to achieve dynamic compensation. A surprising repositioning, diving into the White camp, seemingly offering a piece for tempo and opening lines against the isolated pawns. Liberating the rook from its cramped quarter allows it to seek active squares, aiming to contest crucial open files and challenge Black's encroaching pieces that have solidified their central presence. That sudden knight sortie, unleashing a powerful diagonal assault on White's queen and threatening discovered tactics, injects a jolt of dynamism into the otherwise stable position, forcing a hasty White defense. Reclaiming the central square with pawn aggression is a bold gambit, aiming to destabilize Black's knight and open lines for White's attack, though it risks a structural weakening that could be exploited later if the initiative fades. The bishop pair now feels quite vulnerable, and black's queen retreat to this square allows white to reinforce the central pressure and potentially exploit the open files that have emerged. Strategically, pushing this pawn creates a clear pathway for the queen to potentially redeploy, or it might be a subtle probe to see if black is comfortable with their current defensive setup. It's a move that doesn't immediately win material or create a direct threat, suggesting a longer-term plan is in motion. Observe how this pawn's advance influences the squares around it, and whether it offers new attacking possibilities or simply acts as a defensive bolster. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside now becomes a desperate gamble, as black forcefully challenges white's central pawn structure and pries open the e-file for potential counterplay. Unlocking the queen's diagonal here dramatically shifts the focus towards black's exposed king, threatening an immediate and decisive attack. Instantly transforming the tactical landscape, the queen's exchange liberates the kings from imminent danger, albeit by sacrificing attacking initiative and potentially simplifying into a less favorable pawn structure for black. The doubled pawns on the g-file now offer a clear structural weakness, potentially becoming targets as the queens exit the board, inviting a more active rook presence along the newly opened highway. Reclaiming a central out-of-play knight, black initiates a tactical sequence aimed at disrupting white's seemingly solid pawn structure, forcing a calculation of exchanges that could lead to a more open, dynamic middle game where piece activity and pawn weaknesses become paramount. Reclaiming central influence, this maneuver reestablishes a strong defensive presence on the third rank, aiming to untangle the pinned knight and prepare for future breakthroughs. The king, finally leaving the relative safety of the castled position, ventures towards the center, a bold maneuver seeking to escape the queenside pressure and perhaps participate in the upcoming pawn skirmishes, signaling a potential shift towards a more active defensive posture. Unleashing a pawn storm begins, aiming to disrupt black's defenses and carve out new attacking avenues. A bold pawn sacrifice to rip open lines around white's king, aiming to exploit the suddenly exposed f-file and create active piece play. The pawn push opens a vital path for the rook, threatening to infiltrate the queenside and disrupt black's defensive structure. Sacrificing the rook in this chaotic position is a bold gambit, aiming to disrupt white's central dominance and exploit the exposed king by opening lines, though it allows white to maintain a significant material advantage. The pawn advance creates immediate pressure on the open f-file, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and potentially launch a decisive attack against the enemy king. A daring sacrifice to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines towards the exposed monarch. Disrupting the enemy's king's safety is paramount after a series of exchanges, and capturing that knight opens a direct path to expose the black monarch. The exposed white king now faces a devastating battery on the f-file as the bishop, no longer pinned, completes its destructive ascent, creating a mating net. White seeks to stabilize the board after the recent exchanges, aiming to activate the knight by moving it to a central square where it can influence more of black's territory. Seizing the immediate opportunity to reclaim material, this move sacrifices tactical nuance for a clear gain, simplifying the position and potentially setting up a more favorable endgame structure where black's minor piece is significantly outmatched by white's rooks. Focusing on regaining the initiative after a complex exchange, this maneuver aims to reactivate the rook from its passive defensive posture and potentially challenge the open file, creating new avenues for pressure on black's somewhat exposed king. Re-establishing pawn dominance on the queenside offers a crucial respite from the immediate tactical skirmishes. Instantly solidifying the pawn structure and preparing to unleash the remaining minor pieces into the fray, this recapture aims to activate white's rook along the newly opened file. The bishop, having completed its journey to the queenside, now aims to disrupt white's central control, creating potential forks or pins against the rook on f2 and the pawn on e3 if white isn't careful. A bold endgame maneuver, sacrificing material to break open the crucial diagonal for the rook and usher in a new phase of the game. Shattering white's central pawn chain, this capture unleashes a powerful discovered attack on the king, forcing an immediate response that will dismantle the opponent's pawn structure. Securing the monarch becomes paramount with the passed pawn now poised to advance, forcing a rethink of the king's safety amidst the exchanged pieces. The rook's relocation to the second rank initiates a critical endgame battle, where the surviving pawn on the king's file becomes a fascinating target for black's remaining heavy pieces. Securing the passed pawn's advance by clearing the path for the rook is the immediate priority, even if it means repositioning the king to a more active square. The endgame transition is now cemented. Black's rook has secured a critical infiltration, promising a formidable threat against white's isolated pawns. White's king, having shed its protective pawn shield, now steps into the fray, aiming to become an active participant in this endgame by seeking central influence and potentially supporting a passed pawn advance later. The pawn's capture on g5 finally settles the dust in the center, opening a clear path for the remaining pieces to maneuver. Solidifying the king's position becomes paramount as the board empties, aiming to prevent any sneaky checks or discovered attacks that could jeopardize the newfound material advantage.